Well, let me ask you a question. I'm going to be brave this morning. How many of you have ever heard a sermon preached on Tamar? Probably not. Very few. Maybe Dolores has. He had a brave pastor. This is one of the more graphic portions of the Bible. You could say it's R-rated. And it's a very disturbing part. It kind of, in 1989, I never saw the movie, but the title of the movie popped in my mind. There was a movie that came out in 1989 called Sex, Lies, and Videotape. And this is basically a story of sex and lies without the videotape. But the reason I'm sharing it is because Tamar is the first woman in Jesus' genealogy. And this story is challenging because Tamar's actions is one of those things that you would debate in ethics class at seminary. Whether what Tamar did was really the right thing to do, but yet God did through that an incredible work. And so we're going to take a look at this story. We're going to start with Matthew. That's our jumping off point. So we're talking about Jesus' family tree. And Matthew writes in Matthew 1, the genealogy, a genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. We talked about Abraham last week. Abraham fathered Isaac. Isaac fathered Jacob. Jacob fathered Judah and his brothers. Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And so she is the first woman in Jesus' genealogy. Now, I want to set the stage because this is something we forget a lot of times. There is a cosmic war going on. It's going on right now. It's centered in the Middle East, by the way. And if you know the story, of course, Satan wanted to be the god of this earth. You know, I think Satan saw God create the earth and Adam and Eve, and Satan's like, how many of those creatures are there going to be? And God says billions one day. And Satan's like, I want to be their God. And when Satan decided he wanted to be our God, sin entered into his heart. He rebelled against God. And so Satan, one of the first things he does is he goes into the Garden of Eden. I think he already knew Adam and Eve. That's another story. That's why they weren't surprised when they talked to him. And he tells them, hey, God's trying to cheat you. And he tempts Eve, and she eats of the fruit. Adam eats of the fruit. And so God comes to the garden and says, look, you guys have sinned, and you're separated from me. But Genesis 3:15, he gives this incredible prophecy. God says, I will put hostility between you and the woman, talking to Satan there, the serpent and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and he will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. And remember, Satan doesn't know, and he's not omniscient. He doesn't know everything. All he knows is what he learns. And so at this point, he learns that there is some man who is coming. He doesn't know who he is. And so Adam and Eve have Cain and Abel, and as Satan, again, just kind of, he's watching these two boys, and Abel is offering sacrifices that are pleasing to God, and Cain is not. So I believe, the Bible doesn't explicitly say this, but I believe that Satan incites Cain to kill his brother. Because Cain is thinking Abel must be that one that was just promised. And so Cain kills Abel. You know the story. But it turns out Abel wasn't the promised one who was coming. And now the problem is Adam and Eve are having a bunch of children. So which one am I going to kill? Satan can't, I don't know. So as humanity begins to multiply, Satan's like, okay, we've just got to corrupt humanity. Let's just corrupt the human race and try to stop this promised one from coming. And so, as you know the story in Genesis 6, it alludes to the fallen angels, the sons of God who habit with daughters of men. We have Nephilim, giants on the earth. Human DNA is corrupted. According to the book of 1 Enoch, these fallen angels teach humanity astrology, spells, potions, all sorts of this. And the wickedness on the earth gets so great that God's like, I'm just going to destroy it all. But there's one man named Noah. And if you read the text closely, the idea that he was blameless wasn't that he was sinless, but that he was untouched by the corruption of the Nephilim and all that was going on. And so God calls Noah, tells him to build an ark, and his 3 sons and their wives. And of course, they get into the ark. The rest of humanity ignores Noah and is killed. But we know that the Nephilim survived past those days. That's what Genesis 6:4 tells us. And after Noah comes out of the ark, as you know the story, He gets drunk. His son Ham comes in. We don't know exactly what Ham does, but it's very egregious. And Ham goes and tells his brothers. His brothers walk in backwards so they don't see their father's nakedness. They cover him. Noah wakes up, realizes what Ham had done to him, and Noah curses not Ham, but his son Canaan. The reason I believe he curses Canaan is because he saw in Noah's son Nephilim characteristics. And it's very interesting that what happens after that story, if you follow Genesis, is another person is raised up by the name of Nimrod. The way he's described in Genesis also is very reflective that he was Nephilim, had Nephilim in him. And he goes and he starts cities such as Nineveh, which later becomes the capital of Assyria, which ends up taking the northern half of Israel. He also starts Babylon, which later takes Israel into captivity. And of course we know about Mystery Babylon. And so he starts these cities, these wicked cities, and humanity basically migrates down into that area known as the land of Shinar, and the majority migrate in Babel, which is where they build this big tower. They all speak one language, and basically they're defying God, because God said, go out and populate the earth. But humanity's like, no, we're going to stay here. And so God comes down, he flicks down the tower, confuses the languages, everybody scatters. All of Ham's descendants go to Israel and northern Africa. Why do they go there? Because I believe that's where the Garden of Eden was originally located. And Satan knew God had his eye on that land. And so he's trying to stop whatever this promised one is from coming from that land. Others, the Shem's descendants go, and also Japheth's descendants go and migrate to other places. Genesis chapter 10, God tells the nations of the earth, there's 70, basically, I'm handing you over, I'm not going to fool with you anymore, and I'm going to start my own. And he calls a man named Abraham. We talked about that last week. He calls Abraham out and says, I'm going to start a people through you. And Abraham and his wife, of course, you know, go down to Canaan. Now remember, now Satan knows that not only this promised one is a male, but he's going to be through Abraham's line. So they go down to Canaan. There's a drought in the land. And Abraham, instead of staying where God sent him to, he goes to Egypt, which is one of Satan's home base at that point. It's all Canaanite territory. And there Abraham picks up Hagar. Sarah picks up Hagar. And later they return back to Canaan. But again, Abraham and Sarah had not had any children. It had been several years, and I believe Satan puts the idea into Sarah's mind, why don't you just have a child through Hagar, my Egyptian slave? Abraham says, okay, and that produces Ishmael, and God says, no, it's going to be through Sarah that your line is going to come. And several years pass, and ultimately Sarah and Abraham have Isaac. He is the son of promise. And then, as you know, as the story goes later, Isaac, when he gets older, Abraham sends his servant go back to the Shemite clan, which is where Abraham's from, not from the Canaanites, get a daughter. He brings back Rebekah, and Isaac and Rebekah get married. They have two sons, Esau and Jacob. Of course, Satan, I believe, thought that Esau was going to be the one, so he does everything he can to corrupt Esau. And, of course, Esau ends up marrying two Canaanite women, which was abhorrent to Jacob and Rebekah, and Esau sells off his birthright, and then at the end Jacob tricks Esau and gets the blessing. Esau's like, I'm going to kill you. Rebekah says, get out of town, go back to my family. So he goes back up to the Shemite clans, and there he meets Rebekah, who he loves, but of course he's tricked by his father-in-law and ends up marrying Leah. And then he gets Rebekah. And then there's a crazy story where they're having a baby competition, and every time one of them starts falling behind, she says, why don't you marry my maidservant? So he ends up having babies through 4 people. And so he has 12 sons and 1 daughter. And so now God renames Jacob Israel. Jacob is now, his sons are the beginning of Israel, the nation of Israel. The patriarchy is complete. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is now complete. And so the nation has been born, but it's still a very small nation. And they move back down to Canaan, which is the land God promised them. Y'all following me? You got to know your Bible history. They move back down to Canaan, and they're there in Canaan. And so again, I'm just trying to think of it from Satan's perspective. He's like, okay, God has now said that is going to be a man. It's going to come through Abraham. It's going to come, and now Jacob's got these 12 sons. God's renamed him Israel, which it must be through his sons. Which one is it? Which one's the promised land? And I think Satan's looking at him saying, well, you know, Jacob really likes this guy Joseph. In fact, God gave Joseph a dream that tells Joseph he's going to be over his brothers. And Jacob really loves Joseph so much, he makes him a coat of many colors. I think I'm going to go after him. He must be the one. And if you know the story, Joseph comes to his brothers. They're off quite a ways from home, and they see their brother Joseph coming. They don't like Joseph. I think Satan kind of gets a lot of anger going in their hearts and covetousness. They don't like that he's daddy's favorite. He's got this coat of many colors. And so Joseph shows up, and they're like, hey, let's kill him. And Reuben says, no, he's the oldest, don't kill him. But then Judah says, why don't we throw him into the pit and we'll sell him? And so they throw Joseph into a pit, and then a bunch of Ishmaelites come by. They're descendants of Canaan. And they sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, where he's taken down to Egypt. Okay? Right after that story, so the Genesis stops where Joseph has been sold to Egypt. We have this in Genesis chapter 38 with Tamar. And then we're going to pick up back with Joseph. So sandwiched in the middle of these stories about Joseph is this weird, somewhat R-rated story. But I want you to see what's going to happen. So let's take a look at it. Genesis chapter 38. And remember, Satan's doing everything he can to stop the promised one from coming. And that's important. At that time, Judah left his brothers and settled near Adullamite named Hira. And there Judah saw a daughter of a Canaanite named Shua, and he took her as his wife, and he slept with her. And she conceived and gave birth to a son, and he named him Now, a couple things I want to point out to you. First of all, notice that Judah left his brothers. I think Judah felt bad in some ways, or guilty, because he was the one who said, let's sell Joseph. And Joseph's been sold. And I think Judah just like, I don't want anything more to do with this family. This is a messed up family. And he leaves his brothers. He moves away from them, and he goes down and settled near an Adullamite named Hira. This must be a guy that he became friends with. And this is, again, deep into Canaanite territory. And so I think he really didn't want anything more to do with his family. He was done with his family, and he moves into this area. And I think he's there to sow his oats. No longer going to be with his family. I'm going to sow my oats. And so there, of course, he sees a daughter of a Canaanite named Shua. Now, I thought about that for a minute. I thought that's interesting. Were the other wives of the other brothers called Canaanites as well? Because they're living in Canaan. Okay? But only Simeon's wife is also called a Canaanite. So only two of the brothers are their wives called Canaanites. And I wondered why that is. And I can't say for certain, but I have a feeling that the reason that Moses made it a point that Judah's wife was a Canaanite was because she would never accept the God of Jacob. That she never converted. That she never came to believe. And that she was a wicked woman. And of course, at that point, that's what Judah wanted. He wanted a wicked woman. And so they have two children, two at this point, and then another one. They have and then they have Onan. And then verse 5, she gave birth to another son, and named him Shelah. And it was at Chazib that she gave birth to him. Now, again, remember, in the Bible, when there's details, you shouldn't ignore them, even the weird ones. Why does he tell us it's at Chazib? Well, the word means disappointment. And I think Moses is conveying to the fact that the youngest son was born in an area that means disappointment, because Judah is being a big, big disappointment. He's left his family. He's married a wicked woman. And he's a disappointment to God. He's a disappointment to his family. Maybe Judah himself at this point is disappointed in himself. He just can't seem to get his life together. And so they have this third son in Chazib. Now, look at what happens. Judah got a wife for arranged marriage. his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. So now we have Tamar. Now we meet Tamar. She is Er's wife. Judah has picked Tamar out. The Bible doesn't call her a Canaanite, so it seems to indicate maybe she wasn't necessarily a wicked woman, but she is Er's wife. Now Judah's firstborn, was evil in the Lord's sight, and the Lord killed him. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us what he did to be so evil. A lot of times the Bible tells us maybe the evil acts of people. I can't prove this, but I just have to wonder if he was abusive to Tamar. If the part of the evilness was this man was a very abusive man to Tamar. And God protects Tamar and kills him. And says, I'm not going to have the firstborn of Judah, who's going to be part of this new nation, to be a wicked man. Now, what happens next sounds really foreign to us, all right? Because in our world, if you have the oldest brother dies, in our world, the wife usually leaves, and if she's young and stuff, she'll go get remarried, right? She'll meet somebody else, meet another family. But you have to remember, in that culture, it was very important that the family line be perpetuated. Not so much in our culture, but it was very important that the family line keep going. And especially with Israel. I mean, Israel's a brand new, not really technically a nation. They're kind of in the embryonic stage. And so it's super important that these lines continue. And so there was a Levitic rule that if the firstborn died and they had no children, that the secondborn took the wife for himself, and he had children through her. And the children would count as the firstborn's children. So the line would continue through the firstborn. Now that sounds odd to us, but that's just how that culture did to preserve the line. And so, this is where it gets a little crazy. Judah says to Onan, sleep with your brother's wife. Now again, that would just be weird to say in our world, right? But in their world, that's how you continued the line. And that was important. Perform your duty as a brother-in-law and produce offspring for your brother. Let's keep the firstborn line going. We need to do this. This is very important. But Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. So whenever he slept with his brother's wife, he released his semen on the ground so that he would not produce offspring for his brother. Onan is treating Tamar like an object. Just to be honest, he's using Tamar for sex. In a lot of ways, I would say this is another reason I think was abusive to Tamar. His brother's following the same thing. It's just in a different way. It may have been that was physically abusive to Tamar, but now Onan's just using her for sex. And he's treating her like an object. He's not doing what he's supposed to do. He's abusing Tamar too. This is, I believe, an abused woman. She's being abused at the hands of two evil men. And what does God do? God kills him. This was evil in the Lord's sight, so he put him to death. Now, this passage has been wildly misinterpreted many times and tried to argue points that aren't valid. The point of this was Onan had a responsibility and he wasn't doing it. And he was abusing Tamar. That's the point of the passage. And that's why God killed him. And so Judah has one more son left. And so Judah's like, hey. So Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, and I can't blame him, he might die too. I mean, Tamar's kind of looking like the black widow here, okay? I mean, her first husband's killed, her second husband's killed. What's she giving them to eat? I don't know. And so I don't want my third son to die this way. So he sends her away, notice that, he sends her away to live in her father's house. So he doesn't keep her around his house because he's like, I don't know who's going to die next. Let's get her out of here. And so poor Tamar, I mean, this woman's been abused, she's been used, and now she's got this reputation, at least in the eyes of her father-in-law. I mean, this poor, poor lady, and she's sent to live with her brother. And I think what Judah's thinking is Judah's acting just like his father Judah's father was Jacob, right? And Judah's father, Jacob, was known as a trickster and a deceiver. That's what his name meant. I think Judah is basically saying, I'll send her away. And remember, this is before Facebook and email and all that. So she was probably several miles away. And he's thinking, when Shua gets older, I'm going to marry him off. And then by the time Tamar finds out about it, say, oops, sorry. And my son will be okay. I think that's what he's doing. I think he's sending her away so he can secretly, when Shua gets old enough, marry him off and then just tell Tamar, sorry, I guess you're out of luck. And poor Tamar would have just been stranded. And so it would have been a really mess. And so again, Judah is not a good guy at this point. He's left his family. He's the one who masterminded selling his brother Joseph. He's left his family. He's married I believe, a wicked woman. That's why she's called a Canaanite woman. And they've raised 2 wicked sons. And now he's trying to trick his daughter-in-law to moving away so that he can hopefully marry off his younger son and she not find about it till it's too late. This guy's not a good guy. I mean, as one of the 12 leaders of the 12 who would become a leader of the 12 tribes, this guy is not a good man, just to be honest with you. He's not a good man. So the passage continues. After a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. And when Judah had finished mourning, he and his friend Hira, again, that's the guy he moved to be near, so apparently, and again, this guy would be a Canaanite, went up to Timnah to do sheep shearing. Now, you may think, well, they were just going up there to shear sheep. Actually, sheep shearing was a big pagan festival. It was a time of partying and debauchery. And again, Judah's going with his Canaanite friend. They're going to go up and they're going to party. His wife is dead, and he's footloose and fancy-free, and he's going to go up and he's going to party like a pagan at the sheep shearing event. Now, Tamar gets word, verse 13. So Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. And what happens next, if you were in ethics class at seminary, would be one of these passages that would be really debated. She took off her widow clothes, veiled her face, covered herself, and sat at the entrance of Enam, which is on the way to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had grown up, she had not been given to him as a wife. So again, Tamar is like, I'm not going to get married to him. She's figured out the plan. All right, a long time has passed. Judah's wife has died. Tamar's figured out, she's probably counted her calendar and said, she was old enough, I'm not getting any word. He's up to something. Because my father-in-law is an evil man. I need to do something. So she takes off her widow clothes, she dresses up like a prostitute, and she sits on the side of the road. She knows Judah's going to pass by her. And when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. So he went over her and said, come, let me sleep with you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. Now, real quickly. Tamar doesn't proposition Judah. Typically, I never had this happen, just from what I know, prostitutes will come up to people, right? I mean, I've been in some places at night, driving through Indy and other places where I've seen women that I'm pretty sure were prostitutes, okay? You could tell by they dress. But they usually come up to the person and they, hey, baby, Is that a pretty good invitation? I don't know. But notice Tamar doesn't do that. Tamar's not walking up to Judah saying, hey, baby. Tamar's just sitting on the side of the road. It's Judah that goes up to her because he's a wicked dude. He's like, hey, I want to sleep with you. No sense of, even though his wife's passed away, doesn't give you free rein to go out there and be a wild person. But he wants to sleep with her. Now, again, she has a veil. Again, prostitutes in our world don't do this, but she has a veil over his face. He doesn't know that it's his daughter-in-law. And so Tamar is very cunning here. She says, hey, what will you give me for sleeping with me? And Judah says, well, I'll send you a young goat from my flock. Now, she says, only if you leave something with me, well, until you send it. So I'm only going to sleep with you if you leave something with me. It's like, well, I'll give you a goat, okay? Now, again, I know we think a goat, but in that world, livestock was currency, okay? I mean, your wealth was determined by how many animals you owned. So this was a pretty valuable thing he's given her, but here's the thing. There's no way she could prove that goat was from Judah. It just looked like any other goat. So she wants more specifics. He says, what should I give you? He asked. She answered, your signet ring, your cord, and the staff in your hand. And so he gave them to her, and he slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. So he got up and left. Then she got up and left, removed her veil, and put on her widow's clothes back again. And when Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite in order to get back the items he had left with the woman, he could not find her. He asked the men of the place, where is the cult prostitute who was beside the road at Eam? There has been no cult prostitute here, they answered. So the Adullamite returned to Judah, saying, I could not find her. And besides, the men of the place said, there is no cult prostitute there. And Judah replied, let her keep the items for herself, otherwise we'll become a laughingstock. What's he saying? I was had. I thought she was a prostitute. And they're like, no, we don't have cult prostitutes at this area. And Judah's like, well, I don't want to admit then that I was had, so all right, just let her keep it. After all, I sent this young goat, but you couldn't find it. Hey, my conscience is clear. I did what I had to do. I don't want to become a laughingstock. Just let it go. About 3 months later, Judah was told, your daughter-in-law, Tamar, has been acting like a prostitute, and now she's pregnant. What's happening? She's showing. Got the baby bump going on. She's not supposed to have the baby bump, right? And now she's pregnant. Bring her out, Judah said, and let her be burned to death, which he could have done. He could have still had her burned to death because she wasn't supposed to be doing that. She's his daughter-in-law. Now, Judah's not been treating her right, but that's beside the point, right, in his mind. And she was brought out. As she was being brought out, she sent her father-in-law this message, I am pregnant by the one man to whom these items belong. And she said, examine them. Whose signet ring, cord, and staff are these? And Judah recognized him and said, she is more in the right than I am, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her again intimately. Now, something happened at that moment. When Tamar presented those things, Judah could have said, you must have stolen those, but he doesn't. He could have said, no, those aren't mine. They look like mine, but they're not mine. He doesn't. When she presents him with the hard evidence, Judah is hit right here. He knows he's guilty. And he makes a change. And in that moment, God used Tamar to reveal Judah's hard heart to himself. And I would submit to you at this point, this is a turning point for Judah. He realizes how far he was from God, the God of his father Jacob. That maybe that he never really knew the God of his father Jacob. He knew about him but didn't really know him. And at this moment is a turning point for Judah. He's not going to be dishonest with Tamar. He's not going to deny it. I admit it. Now, Tamar made a risky move by sleeping with her father, by trusting up. This was a risky move. She could have been killed. But she was willing to take a risky move because she was more interested in keeping the family line going than her own father-in-law. And that's why Judah says, she has done more right than I am. Judah's like, she was willing to take the risk, possibly be killed for this act, but she was more interested in preserving our family than I have been. And I think that hits him at that moment. He realizes, I'm a wicked guy. I'm a bad guy. I need to change my life. Something is wrong here. Now, again, for a short time, I went to Bob Jones, and we had all these sayings that were constantly drilled in our head, and Dr. Bob Sr. said, it's never right to do wrong to do right. It's never right to do wrong to do right. Well, in this case, Tamar did wrong to do right. And I'm not so sure that a saying is always accurate, because I think about the midwives who didn't kill the babies when Moses was coming along, and they lied to Pharaoh. And I think about people like Corrie ten Boom who lied about the Jews who were in her house. There are times when you need to do wrong to do right. Now, they're very, 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 very few. And we can argue whether Tamar did the right thing. We can argue that back and forth, but the bottom line is she took a risk because she was more interested in preserving the family line than her own father-in-law. And Judah says she did the right thing, or she at least cared more than I did. And I think at that moment, Judah's life was changed. You say, how do you know that, Brother Jim? Well, the next chapter, real quickly, picks back up with Joseph. And if you know the story, he has been sold to Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife accuses him of attempted rape. He's thrown into jail. While he's in jail, the king's cupbearer and cake maker, baker, have dreams, and they go to Judah because they've heard that Joseph can interpret dreams, and Joseph tells the cupbearer, you're going to be raised back to your position, the baker, you're going to be killed, and that's what happens. Unfortunately, the cupbearer forgets about Joseph for the next 2 years, but 2 years later, the Pharaoh has a dream, and the cupbearer says, hey, I know this guy in prison that interpreted my dream, and it happened. So they call Joseph up. God gives Joseph the interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. Pharaoh's so impressed, he makes Joseph the number 2 guy in the land, as you know. And Joseph says there's going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. So for the next 7 years, Joseph gets the land of Egypt ready, and they store a bunch of grain and all sorts of stuff. And then the famine hits. The famine hits not only Egypt, but also Canaan. And in Canaan is Joseph's family. Of course, they don't know that he's still alive. And it gets so desperate that Jacob sends his sons to go to Egypt, except for Benjamin, which was his youngest. And if you know the story, they go to Egypt, and Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize Joseph. Why? Because he looks like an Egyptian, and he talks like an Egyptian, and he walks like an Egyptian, right? So they don't recognize Joseph, but Joseph recognizes them, and Joseph has grain put into their sacks, and if you know the story, he has their silver put back into their sacks. They don't realize that. They go back to Canaan, they open up their sacks of grain, they see silver, and they're like, holy cow, we're in trouble. And Joseph had told them, he had asked about their family when they were back there in Egypt, and he said, bring your younger brother. And so they're back in Canaan now, and they're telling their dad, hey, if we go back, we got to bring our younger brother. Plus, they think we've stolen stuff, so we've got to do what this guy says. We don't know who this guy is. Of course, it was Joseph. And finally, it gets so desperate that it's like, we got to go back, Dad. We're starving. And this is where it's very interesting, because the next time we see Judah is at this point. And Judah goes to his father. This is in Genesis chapter 43. And said, send the boy. That's the youngest son, Benjamin. He was Joseph's other brother, the youngest boy, who was at this time now Jacob's favorite. Send the boy with me. We will be on our way so that we may live and not die, neither we nor you nor our dependents. I will be responsible for him. A couple things to point out. Judah is now back with his family. Do you notice that? He has now moved back with his family. And now he's going to his daddy and saying, I will be personally responsible for Benjamin. We know he's your favorite, Daddy, because he took over Joseph's spot, but I will be personally responsible. You can hold me personally accountable. And if I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, I will be guilty to you forever. Judah says, I'll take full responsibility. That's a different Judah than we saw before. He's now back with his family, and I'll take responsibility. And here's the thing. God uses those who repent. God uses those who repent. And so, you know the story, and Judah and his brothers, they go back to Israel, and they take Benjamin, And of course, Joseph, again, sees them. He has them all come to his house. They don't know it's Joseph still. And then he fills their grain up. And again, he does the same thing. He puts silver back in their bag. They didn't know it. But this time he sneaks his personal cup and has it put into Benjamin's bag, if you know the story. And they leave Joseph's house on their way back to see Daddy. And after they've gone for a little bit of time, Joseph sends one of his servants to chase him down. And his servant opens up Benjamin's sack and says, "You've stolen my master's cup." And the brothers are like, "Oh man, we're dead." And he's like, "You got to come back." And of course, Judah has taken full responsibility for Benjamin. And so they're brought back into the presence of Joseph. And Judah once again takes the lead. And real quickly, chapter 44, when Judah and his brothers reached Joseph's house, he was still there. They fell to the ground before him. "What have you done?" Joseph said. "Didn't you know that a man like me could uncover the truth by divination?" So he's accusing them of stealing, of course. "What can we say, my lord?" Notice who's the spokesman. "What can we say, Lord?" Judah replied. "How can we plead? How can we justify ourselves? God has exposed your servant's iniquity." Now, they didn't steal, but Judah's taken full responsibility. He's going to be the fall guy. And he says, "We are now my Lord's slaves, both we and the one in possession who the cup has been found." And then Judah goes on later and he begs Joseph, "Now please, let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy. Let him go back with the brothers." And so he said, "Without the boy," didn't get that fixed, "without the boy, I could not bear to see the grief that would overwhelm my father." Do you understand what's happening? At this point, they still don't know Joseph's their brother, but Judah says, "Keep me as a slave and let him go back. My life for his." That's a different Judah. He was earlier the guy that wanted to sell Joseph. Now he's saying, "I will be your slave for my brother. I will take full responsibility. I can't bear to see my father in his grief, now having lost Benjamin too. Take me in his place." And fast forward to the end of Jacob's life, many years later. And Jacob is blessing his 12 sons. And outside of Joseph, the longest blessing goes to Judah. And it's very interesting. Normally, the best would be through the firstborn, but it wasn't, because Reuben had slept with Jacob's concubine, so he was out. And Simeon and Levi, the second and third, they were both men of violence because they had killed this whole village of people, avenging Dinah, their sister. Judah was the fourth one. But I submit to you, because Judah's life had taken such a radical change, that it's through him that Jacob says, "The scepter will not depart from Judah, or the staff from between his feet, until he whose right it is comes, and the obedience of the people belongs to him." What's he saying? Judah, I know you're the fourth born, but so far of my kids, you are by far the one that's most devoted to God now. And it's through you that the Messiah will come. It's through your line. Isn't that amazing? And then when you go back to Matthew, Judah fathered Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez fathered Hezron. Judah's firstborn, by a wicked Canaanite woman, God killed him. So the blessing now went through Judah's second firstborn, through a woman who acted riskily but righteously, named Tamar. And because Tamar was so devoted to seeing the family line continue as it should, she was willing to risk her life. And Judah, because of his radical repentance, God said, "I'm going to bring him through your line." And the reality is, God can use anyone who trusts and repents. And God can use you. I think it's an amazing story. It's a troubling story, but it's an amazing story of a man whose life was radically changed when he was faced with his own wickedness. He's like, "Okay, I'm done. And by the way, I forgot to mention earlier, he never slept with Tamar again. He could have argued that was his right, but he said, no, she's my daughter-in-law. A man whose life was radically changed when his light was shined on his own wickedness. And because he repented and trusted the one true God, God used him. And it was shown by his actions. God can use anyone, and he can use you. Amen? Amen. Amen.